Picture a city shrouded in fear, narrow streets filled with the scent of decay, the distant cries of the sick echoing through the air. And then you see them, towering figures draped in black, their faces hidden behind grotesque, bird-like masks. These were the plague doctors, the enigmatic healers who walked the line between life and death during some of humanity's darkest hours. To the people of medieval Europe, they were both saviors and omens, their very presence a reminder that death was never far away. But behind those haunting masks lies a story far more complex than legend suggests. What drove these mysterious figures to face the plague head-on? How did their bizarre costumes actually work, or did they? And why do their images still send a shiver down our spines centuries later? The truth is, the plague doctors were more than just eerie symbols of a bygone era. They were real people navigating an unimaginable crisis, armed with tools and beliefs that seem almost surreal to us today. Their iconic beaked masks weren't just for show, they were part of a desperate attempt to ward off a disease no one understood. Filled with fragrant herbs thought to purify the air, those masks were a blend of superstition and early science, a testament to humanity's struggle to make sense of the unknown. But here's the twist. While their methods may seem strange now, these doctors were often the only ones willing to step into the epicenter of suffering, risking their lives in a world where the plague spared no one. So why does their legacy still captivate us? Perhaps it's because their story mirrors our own fears and resilience in the face of invisible threats. In a time when pandemics were seen as divine punishment, the plague doctors walked a precarious path, part healers, part outcasts, forever etched into history as both guardians and grim reapers. Today, we're going to unravel the myths and realities behind these enigmatic figures, from the science of their peculiar garb to the startling truths about their role in society. This isn't just a tale of medieval medicine. It's a window into how humanity confronts the unknown and how even the most haunting symbols can hide stories of courage, desperation, and the enduring quest for survival. Ready to step into their world, let's begin. The Black Death swept through Europe like a merciless shadow, leaving entire villages empty and cities paralyzed by grief. In this chaos, the first plague doctors appeared, not as seasoned medical experts, but as ordinary men thrust into an impossible role. Many were failed physicians, barbers moonlighting as surgeons, or even criminals given a grim choice: tend to the sick or face execution. Their lack of training was stark, but in a world where the wealthy fled and the church could offer only prayers, someone had to confront the dying. And so, these unlikely figures became the last hope for countless souls, armed with little more than desperation and the strange costumes that would make them infamous. Their outfits weren't just for intimidation. Every element had a purpose, however misguided by the science of the time. The long, waxed robes repelled bodily fluids, while the leather gloves and boots shielded skin from contact with the infected. But it was the mask that became their defining feature, that eerie, bird-like beak stuffed with lavender, mint, or even crushed gems. People believed disease traveled through miasma, the foul air rising from rotting bodies, and the herbs were meant to purify each breath. Imagine walking through streets littered with the dead, relying on the scent of roses to keep death at bay. It was equal parts ingenuity and heartbreaking futility. Yet for all their bizarre methods, plague doctors played a crucial and often overlooked role. They were among the first to document symptoms, enforce quarantines, and even witness the heartbreaking final moments of families wiped out in days. Some towns paid them in silver to stay, while others drove them away with stones, fearing they carried death on their robes. And here's the tragic irony. Those haunting costumes might have saved more lives than we realize. The thick layers and mask offered accidental protection, shielding wearers from flea bites, the true carriers of the plague. So while these doctors didn't understand germ theory, their garb unknowingly defended them against the real enemy. What's striking is how their legacy twists through history. To some, they were heroes, to others, harbingers of doom. But in their struggle, we see humanity's raw determination to fight back against the unknown, even when armed with nothing but folklore and courage. Their story isn't just about medieval medicine, it's about the lengths we'll go to when faced with the unthinkable. And perhaps that's why, centuries later, the sight of that beaked mask still sends a chill down our spines. It's not just a relic of the past, it's a mirror reflecting our own fears and the fragile line between superstition and survival. That eerie, elongated beak protruding from the plague doctor's mask wasn't just for theatrical effect. It was a desperate fusion of medieval science and sheer survival instinct. Inside that hollow cavity, a carefully curated mix of dried flowers, spices, and even crushed gemstones created what they believed was a life-saving barrier. Lavender for its calming properties, mint to stimulate breathing, cloves for their antiseptic qualities, each ingredient chosen with the same meticulous care as a modern pharmacist filling a prescription. The logic seemed sound at the time. If bad smells caused disease, then surely overpowering those odors with sweet fragrances would keep the doctor safe. What makes this so fascinating is how close they were, and yet how terribly wrong. The concept of filtering air wasn't misguided. We still use masks today for that very purpose. But without understanding bacteria or viruses, their solution targeted the wrong enemy. Those aromatic herbs may have made the stench of rotting corpses bearable, but they did nothing to stop the fleas that actually spread the plague. The beak itself, often measuring over 6 inches, did provide accidental social distancing, keeping the doctor's face farther from coughs and sneezes. Some designs even included glass eye coverings, an early attempt at eye protection that shows how observant these practitioners could be when piecing together clues about transmission. Yet for all its scientific shortcomings, the mask's psychological impact was undeniable. To terrified citizens, that blank stare behind round glass lenses and the ominous beak became the face of the epidemic itself. Children would hide at the sound of the doctor's cane tapping against cobblestones, a warning to clear the way. There are accounts of entire households falling silent when a plague doctor approached, not out of respect but sheer terror. In some towns, the doctors were forbidden from speaking to patients directly, communicating only through gestures to avoid spreading corrupted air. The mask transformed its wearer into something neither fully human nor entirely supernatural, a liminal figure straddling the world of the living and the dead. What's remarkable is how this symbol evolved over time. Originally intended as protective gear, the beaked mask gradually took on new meanings. During carnival celebrations in Venice, revelers would wear exaggerated versions to mock death itself, turning the object of fear into a dark joke. Later, Renaissance artists incorporated the imagery into allegorical paintings about mortality. Today, we see echoes of that distinctive silhouette in everything from steampunk fashion to pandemic preparedness memes, proof that this medieval invention still resonates in our collective imagination. The true legacy of the beaked mask lies in what it reveals about human ingenuity under pressure. Faced with an invisible killer, these doctors constructed elaborate defenses based on the best knowledge available. While their methods seem primitive now, their willingness to confront the unknown with whatever tools they had, whether scented herbs or leather gloves, speaks to a courage we can still recognize. In an age when we debate the effectiveness of N95 respirators, their story reminds us that the struggle to balance protection, fear, and scientific understanding is far from new. That haunting beak endures not just as a relic of superstition, but as a testament to our eternal dance with the unknown. The wax-coated robes of the plague doctors weren't just for show, they were a makeshift hazmat suit centuries ahead of their time. Drenched in animal fat or beeswax, the heavy fabric created a barrier against the bodily fluids and pus that soaked the beds of the infected. Imagine sweltering under that stifling layer in the summer heat, the wax melting slightly with every step, all while navigating streets where the air itself felt poisonous. Yet this grim uniform was just one piece of a larger survival strategy that blurred the lines between medicine and mythology. Take the long wooden cane clutched in every plague doctor's hand. Far from a walking aid, it served as a primitive medical tool, a way to lift blankets, adjust clothing, or even take a patient's pulse without making direct contact. Some canes had hollow compartments filled with vinegar or aromatic herbs, turning them into rudimentary disinfectant dispensers. Others doubled as instruments of discipline, used to beat back desperate crowds or keep the dying at arm's length. In an age when touch could mean death, that cane became a lifeline, extending the doctor's presence while maintaining a fragile illusion of safety. Then there were the more theatrical rituals, like burning sulfur or dousing rooms in vinegar fumes. Medieval observers swore they saw the very air shimmer with corruption, so it made sense to attack the sickness where they believed it lived, in the atmosphere. Doctors would ignite sulfur in sick rooms, filling the space with acrid smoke meant to purify the air, not realizing they were accidentally creating sulfur dioxide, a compound we now know has mild disinfectant properties. Vinegar, too, was poured over doorways or soaked into sponges pressed against the nose, its sharp tang masking the stench of decay while offering negligible protection. What's revealing is how these practices mirrored the era's deepest fears. When people watched a plague doctor wave a smoking torch through a house, they weren't just seeing a medical procedure, they were witnessing an exorcism of sorts, a battle against unseen demons. The rituals gave shape to the invisible enemy, offering a semblance of control in a world where up to half a town could vanish in weeks. And in a cruel twist, some methods may have helped in ways no one understood at the time. The wax robes, for instance, likely repelled fleas better than plain cloth, while the sulfur smoke drove rats from homes, unknowingly removing the plague's true carriers. Yet for all their elaborate precautions, plague doctors were often powerless. Accounts describe them reciting prayers or astrology charts as patients choked on their own blood, their science collapsing under the weight of the epidemic. Some resorted to bleeding victims or applying leeches, techniques that only hastened death. Others simply stood by, documenting symptoms with cold precision as entire families perished. This duality, part healer, part helpless witness, is what makes their legacy so haunting. They marched into the heart of darkness armed with little more than folklore and wax, their very costumes a metaphor for the thin veneer separating order from chaos. Perhaps that's why these rituals endure in our imagination. They remind us that crisis breeds innovation, even when that innovation is built on misunderstanding. Today, we might smile at the thought of crushed emeralds in a beak mask, but how different is it, really, from our own rush to unproven remedies when fear takes hold? The plague doctor's story isn't just about medieval Europe, it's about the universal human need to fight back, however we can, when the world feels like it's unraveling. Their wax robes and sulfur fires were more than medical theater. They were a defiant stand against the unknown, a declaration that even in the face of certain death, humanity refuses to surrender without a struggle. In the shadow of mass graves and abandoned homes, the plague doctor's arrival often sparked terror rather than relief. Their ominous silhouette at a town's gates could send families barricading doors, whispering that the masked figure had come not to heal, but to mark the next household for death. This wasn't just superstition, it was the brutal psychology of survival. When entire communities watched loved ones succumb within days, the human mind scrambled for patterns, for someone to hold responsible. Who better to blame than the stranger who moved freely among the dying, their costumes soaked in the stench of pestilence? Historical records reveal chilling examples of this misplaced fury. In Marseille, a plague doctor was stoned to death by a mob convinced he'd poisoned the water supply. Venetian accounts describe medical staff being chased through canals, their beaked masks torn off as symbols of witchcraft. Even in cities where doctors were hired to help, their wages often came with unspoken threats. Payment meant they'd stay away from the homes of the wealthy, treating only the poor in segregated districts. The very precautions meant to protect them became evidence of guilt. Why else would someone need waxed robes and a herb-filled mask unless they were in league with the disease itself? The irony cuts deep. These were often the only individuals brave enough to enter plague-stricken homes, yet their courage bred suspicion. Parish records show some doctors worked tirelessly, moving from town to town like ghostly nomads welcomed nowhere, remembered only in ledgers noting their meager payments. Others faced accusations of theft or grave robbing, their movements mistrusted as they documented fatalities. In a macabre twist, their role as record keepers sometimes backfired. When they tallied the dead, frightened citizens saw not compassion, but a death toll being curated. What makes this scapegoating so poignant is how it mirrors our modern responses to crisis. The same instinct that made medieval villagers blame the doctor resurfaces today when we vilify healthcare workers during outbreaks or accuse minorities of spreading disease. The plague doctor's story holds up a dark mirror to our enduring need for simple explanations in complex tragedies. Their persecution reminds us that fear rarely follows logic. It follows the path of least resistance, settling on whoever stands closest to the carnage. Yet within this darkness glimmers an unexpected truth. Some communities eventually erected monuments to these maligned figures, recognizing too late their sacrifices. A handful of doctors' journals surface moments of unexpected grace, notes about children who brought them flowers, or elders who thanked them with whispered blessings. These fragile acts of kindness reveal the other side of human nature, the capacity to see helpers where others saw harbingers. The plague doctors walked a razor's edge between reverence and revulsion, their legacy forever caught in the tension between what we fear and what we fail to understand. The weight of that beaked mask extended far beyond its physical form. It pressed down on the souls of those who wore it. Imagine walking into rooms where entire families lay in their own filth, their skin blackened by buboes, their final breaths thick with the metallic scent of blood. Plague doctors didn't just witness death, they waded through it daily, their gloved hands brushing against the feverish brows of patients who would be corpses by morning. No amount of waxed fabric could shield them from the psychological torment of being surrounded by suffering they were powerless to stop. Some journals survive, offering haunting glimpses into their unraveling minds. One doctor in Florence wrote of dreaming in screams, his sleep filled with phantom coughs that followed him into daylight. Another in Vienna described washing his hands until they bled, convinced the plague clung to his skin like a curse. The isolation was crushing, shunned by the healthy, feared by the dying. Many plague doctors became spectral figures, drifting between empty taverns where landlords refused to serve them. It's no surprise that accounts mention rampant alcoholism among their ranks. Wine wasn't just an escape, but a desperate attempt to dull the constant reek of decay that seeped into their clothing, their hair, their very pores. Yet what's astonishing isn't how many broke under the strain, but how many persisted. In Marseille, a doctor named Laurentius documented over 2,000 deaths single-handedly, noting each name with meticulous care even as his own hands trembled from exhaustion. Why, for some, it was sheer survival criminals coerced into service, or impoverished healers willing to risk death for a purse of silver, but others spoke of a quieter resolve. A Venetian physician's letter reveals his reason. If not me, then who? In a world where even priests sometimes fled, these men became reluctant shepherds, guiding souls to thresholds they couldn't cross themselves. The toll manifested in eerie ways. Some developed rituals bordering on obsession, counting steps between houses, reciting psalms before entering rooms, or refusing to touch door handles without cloth barriers. Others grew numb, their clinical notes detailing horrors with chilling detachment. Child, approximately 8 years, expired between the midnight bell and dawn. A few even embraced dark humor, like the Parisian doctor who kept a ledger titled God's Arithmetic, tallying deaths as if keeping score against the divine. Perhaps the most tragic were those who outlived the plagues only to be broken by the aftermath. Survivors often associated them with death itself, blaming them for losses that were never their fault. In Nuremberg, an aging plague doctor was found wandering the streets years later, still wearing his tattered mask long after the epidemic ended, a living ghost trapped in the nightmare he'd tried to combat. Their stories force us to ask, what does it cost to stand between humanity and the abyss? The answer lingers in those handwritten journals, between lines stained with wine and what might have been tears. They remind us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the will to keep walking forward when every instinct screams to run. This is the untold heart of their legacy, not the masks or the herbs, but the fragile humans beneath the costume. In an age before trauma was understood, before counseling or support systems existed, these men carried burdens that would crack most of us today. Their endurance speaks to something primal in the human spirit, the capacity to face unimaginable darkness not as heroes, but as flawed, frightened people who chose to bear witness when looking away would have been easier. That's why their ghosts still haunt us, not because they failed, but because they tried at all. Long before the plague doctors faded into history, their haunting image began its transformation into something far more enduring, a cultural symbol. Renaissance artists were among the first to immortalize them, not as medical figures, but as allegories of mortality. In 16th century woodcuts, the beaked mask appears alongside dancing skeletons and hourglasses, a grim reminder that death comes for all. Look closely at Pieta Bruegel's The Triumph of Death, and you'll spot a figure eerily reminiscent of a plague doctor amidst the chaos, his elongated beak peering over piles of corpses. These weren't portraits of real physicians, they were manifestations of the era's existential dread, giving form to the invisible terror that had ravaged Europe. The mask's journey through literature is equally revealing. In Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, written decades after the actual events, the narrator describes encountering a dismal figure in a strange headpiece, moving through London's abandoned streets, a fictionalized plague doctor whose presence signals impending doom. By the 19th century, romantic poets like Edgar Allan Poe latched onto the imagery, morphing the figure into something more gothic. Poe's The Mask of the Red Death doesn't feature a plague doctor outright, but the spectral figure draped in blood-stained robes owes much to the same archetype, an embodiment of disease that slips past barriers of wealth and privilege. Fast forward to modern cinema, and the transformation becomes even more striking. Horror films like The Plague Doctor or video games like Assassin's Creed repurpose the mask as shorthand for menace, its blank eyes and beak evoking primal unease. Yet there's a curious duality here. While pop culture often reduces the figure to a villain, medical historians point out how the same silhouette has been adopted by some pandemic preparedness campaigns. During the COVID-19 crisis, murals appeared in Italy depicting plague doctors wearing face shields, a poignant nod to how little has changed in our collective psyche. What fuels this enduring fascination? Part of it lies in the mask's unsettling ambiguity. Unlike other medical symbols, the caduceus or the Red Cross, the plague doctor's garb doesn't signify pure benevolence. It exists in a liminal space equally associated with healing and horror. This duality resonates in times of crisis, when society grapples with its own contradictions. We celebrate healthcare workers as heroes, yet during outbreaks, they've often been met with suspicion. Just like their medieval counterparts, the plague doctor's image endures because it captures this paradox: the healer who carries the taint of death, the savior we instinctively fear. Even fashion and subcultures have reclaimed the symbol. Steampunk enthusiasts adorn their goggles with beaked filters, while haute couture runways have reinterpreted the mask in glittering metals. This appropriation reveals something unexpected. The very thing meant to repel has become a canvas for creativity. Perhaps by reinventing the mask, we're attempting to tame its terror, transforming a relic of suffering into an emblem of resilience. At its core, the plague doctor's persistence in art and culture reflects our unresolved relationship with mortality. Their image is a Rorschach test. Some see a warning, others see defiance. When a Renaissance painter included that beaked figure in a mural about Judgment Day, or when a modern filmmaker makes it the monster in a slasher flick, they're tapping into the same fundamental question: how do we confront the inevitable? The mask isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a mirror, reflecting our oldest fears and our stubborn refusal to look away. When the plague doctor entered a sick room, his satchel carried more than herbs. It held the crushing weight of expectation. Inside lay an arsenal of medieval medicine: rust-stained lancets for bloodletting, jars of mercury-laced ointments, and vials of unicorn horn powder, usually ground narwhal tusk. These weren't treatments, they were acts of theater performed on the edge of the abyss. Take the infamous vinegar of the Four Thieves, a potion rumored to protect its drinkers, made with garlic, wormwood, and stolen grave goods soaked in vinegar. That desperate families paid their last coins for such concoctions speaks not to their effectiveness, but to the raw human need to believe survival was possible. Historical records reveal treatments bordering on torture. Some doctors would slice open buboes, the egg-sized lymph nodes swollen with infection, then cauterize the wounds with red-hot pokers. Others prescribed theriac, a revolting paste of viper flesh and opium that induced vomiting while doing nothing for the plague, the cruelest irony. Many cures accelerated death. Bloodletting weakened already fragile patients, while mercury compounds poisoned them slowly. Yet what choice did people have? When the alternative was lying untreated as your skin blackened, even a 5% chance seemed worth grasping. This phenomenon isn't confined to the Middle Ages. During the 2020 COVID pandemic, people hoarded unproven drugs like ivermectin, echoing the same desperate logic. Crisis breeds magical thinking, the instinct that any action feels better than helplessness. Plague doctors understood this psychology instinctively. Their elaborate rituals burning specific woods, arranging patients according to astrological charts, gave terrified communities a semblance of control. The real medicine wasn't in the potions, but in the performance, the solemn nod, the confident mixing of herbs, the illusion that someone, anyone, had a plan. Some physicians recognized their own futility. A surviving journal from Prague describes a doctor weeping as he applied leeches, knowing full well the child beneath his hands wouldn't see dawn. Others grew cynical, like the Marseille practitioner who charged extra for angel's breath. Inhalants basically mint leaves in a silver tube, yet even these charlatans served an unexpected purpose. By offering something to do, they prevented panic from boiling over into riots or mass suicides. In this light, the plague doctor's greatest contribution wasn't medical, it was psychological. Their presence created fragile stability, a temporary bulwark against the terror of absolute uncertainty. What lingers isn't just the tragedy of useless cures, but what they reveal about human resilience. Faced with certain death, people will reach for anything resembling hope, however flimsy. Those bloodlettings and bezoar stones represent more than medieval ignorance. They're testament to our species' refusal to surrender quietly. The plague doctors, for all their misguided methods, understood one profound truth. Sometimes the most vital medicine isn't what heals the body, but what keeps the spirit fighting long enough for real solutions to emerge. Their legacy warns us that in pandemics, the line between healer and placebo is thinner than we'd like to admit, and that the hunger for hope can outlast even the darkest days. In the chaos of the plague years, desperation became a currency, and some plague doctors were its most ruthless bankers. While many risked their lives for meager wages, others saw the epidemic as an opportunity, transforming suffering into a lucrative trade. These so-called physicians would arrive in stricken towns with grandiose titles, Master of Pestilential Airs or Dr. Mirabilis, claiming secret knowledge passed down from ancient scholars. Their real expertise exploiting terror. For a family watching their loved ones writhe in agony, even the most absurd promise of a cure was worth mortgaging their last possessions. The schemes were as varied as they were cruel. Some sold immunity amulets, bags of crushed garlic and arsenic worn around the neck for sums that could feed a family for months. Others peddled plague water, a dubious elixir supposedly distilled from rare flowers, though most were little more than vinegar with food coloring. The worst offenders operated on a grim subscription model, paying upfront for weekly visits, knowing full well their patients wouldn't survive long enough to demand refunds. Town archives in Lyon record one particularly brazen fraudster who charged by the hour. His treatment consisting of reciting psalms while burning expensive myrrh, a ritual that did nothing but drain grieving families' coffers. What allowed this exploitation to flourish? The answer lies in the breakdown of societal norms. With local governments collapsing and churches overwhelmed, oversight vanished. In Venice, officials turned a blind eye to quacks as long as they serviced the poor districts, keeping wealthier areas clean. Some towns even contracted these charlatans deliberately, preferring cheap, ineffective care over funding real physicians. The line between sanctioned healer and con artist blurred, especially when desperate authorities offered pardons to criminals willing to take the job. A thief might trade his noose for a plague mask, only to resume stealing from the dying under the guise of medicine. Yet the most disturbing aspect wasn't the fraud itself, but how easily communities accepted it. When death feels inevitable, people cling to any narrative that offers control, even one crafted by liars. The same psychology that drives modern scam victims led medieval families to empty their savings for vials of rosewater blessed under a full moon. And just like today, the poorest suffered most. Peasants who couldn't afford the premium treatments were often given placebos or outright poisons, while the wealthy purchased elaborate quarantine boxes, early isolation chambers that, while equally useless against the plague, at least spared them the sight of their neighbors suffering. This dark chapter forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Pandemics don't just test our compassion, they reveal how quickly morality erodes when survival is at stake. The plague doctors who profited from misery weren't anomalies, they were products of a world where death had become mundane, and humanity's worst instincts thrived in the shadows of catastrophe. Their legacy isn't just one of greed, but of the fragile line between civilization and chaos, a line as thin as the wax coating on a charlatan's robe. When the plague swept through a town, the doctor's cane wasn't just for examining patients. It became a tool of enforcement, tapping against doors to mark them with the dreaded Red Cross. Freshly painted in vermilion or blood-red ochre, that symbol transformed homes into prisons, sealing families inside with their dying. Plague doctors didn't just navigate this system. They were its architects in many places, deciding who lived under quarantine, who was dragged to mass graves, and who might, just might, earn a reprieve. Their dual role blurred the line between physician and constable, leaving us to wonder, were these masked figures guardians of the greater good, or accomplices to a ruthless survival calculus? The logistics of medieval quarantine were as chilling as they were ingenious. In Milan, plague doctors pioneered the lazaretto system, isolating the infected on remote islands or in walled pest houses, where the healthy could theoretically wait out the storm. But the reality was grimmer. Eyewitness accounts describe doctors escorting wailing children from their parents' arms, or nailing shut the doors of households where just one person showed symptoms. Venice took it further, deploying armed guards alongside physicians to patrol the canals, ensuring no one slipped away in the night. The message was clear: containment mattered more than compassion when an entire city's survival hung in the balance. What makes this so morally fraught is how quarantine often became a death sentence in itself. Locked inside with no clean water or fresh air, healthy family members would inevitably sicken, their only visitors the plague doctor who came to tally bodies. Some towns added insult to injury by charging families for the privilege of being boarded up, with doctors acting as tax collectors of suffering. Yet in rare cases, these measures worked. The island of Dubrovnik, one of the first to implement mandatory isolation, recorded significantly lower death rates than its neighbors, proving that even crude quarantines could save lives when applied judiciously. The doctor's enforcement duties extended to the dead as well. Tasked with collecting corpses, they'd load carts before dawn, piling bodies like firewood to minimize panic. Their journals reveal macabre dilemmas: leave a corpse to rot and risk spreading disease, or remove it too soon and face accusations of murder from grieving relatives. In Marseille, one physician noted how survivors would cling to loved ones' bodies, forcing him to pry stiffened fingers from shrouds. The psychological toll was immense, not just from handling the dead, but from becoming the face of policies that felt like betrayal. Historians still debate whether these measures were a necessary evil or systemic cruelty. On one hand, plague doctors advocating for early quarantines grasped a fundamental truth about epidemics: slowing transmission buys time. On the other, their participation in harsh edicts like the Venetian practice of dumping symptomatic patients into mass graves alive shows how easily public health can devolve into brutality. Perhaps the most haunting lesson lies in the parallels to modern crises, where debates over lockdowns and personal freedom echo those medieval struggles. The plague doctor's legacy forces us to ask, where does protection end and persecution begin? Their beaked masks may have been meant to ward off disease, but they also shielded wearers from seeing or acknowledging the full human cost of the systems they upheld. The plague doctor's medical kit was less a collection of healing tools and more a snapshot of desperation, each instrument a testament to how little was understood about disease. Among the most notorious were the lancets, sharpened blades used to slice open swollen buboes in a futile attempt to drain bad humors. Imagine the agony, no anesthesia, only the crude belief that releasing pus might restore balance to the body. Some doctors went further, pressing hot irons against the wounds to cauterize them, a brutal practice that often sealed infection deeper inside. Yet what's striking isn't just the brutality, it's the logic behind it. These methods stemmed from Galenic medicine, a 2,000-year-old theory that blamed illness on imbalances in blood, phlegm, and bile. In a world without microscopes, the idea that corrupt fluids needed expulsion made a twisted kind of sense. Alongside the blade sat jars of leeches, their slimy bodies employed for bloodletting, a practice as common as it was catastrophic. Plague doctors would apply dozens to a single patient, believing the creatures could suck out the pestilential essence. Records from Vienna describe children weakened to the point of collapse from excessive bleeding, their pallor mistaken for purification. Yet even here, there's a tragic irony. While bloodletting hastened deaths during the plague, the technique inadvertently advanced future medicine. The precise incisions required for leech application honed surgical skills, laying groundwork for later vascular studies. Sometimes progress emerges from the unlikeliest mistakes. Then there were the more bizarre entries in their arsenal. Plague water, a murky concoction of vinegar, crushed emeralds, and wormwood, was touted as both cure and preventative. Wealthier patients might receive versions infused with gold or powdered unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, priced at exorbitant sums. The real shock. Some of these potions contained trace amounts of mercury or arsenic, substances we now know as poisons, but were then revered for their cleansing properties. A doctor in Marseille noted how patients given mercury-based elixirs would salivate excessively, a reaction misinterpreted as the body expelling toxins rather than a sign of heavy metal poisoning. Yet not all tools were misguided. The plague doctor's wooden cane, often dismissed as a walking stick, served a surprisingly practical purpose. Its hollow tip could store vinegar-soaked sponges for disinfecting hands, while the length allowed doctors to examine patients without direct contact, an early nod to infection control. Some canes even had compartments for herbs like rosemary or sage, not because they cured plague, but because their strong scents masked the stench of decay, making the unbearable slightly more tolerable. What's fascinating is how these tools reflect medicine's painful evolution. For every lancet that harmed, there was an observation that hinted at truth, like the rare physician who noticed flea bites preceded symptoms, even if he blamed bad air instead of the insects themselves. The plague doctor's kit wasn't just a box of horrors, it was a laboratory of trial and error, where each failure edged humanity closer to understanding. When we look at those rusted lancets today, we're not just seeing instruments of suffering, we're witnessing the birth pangs of modern medicine, forged in the darkest of fires. In the dim glow of candlelit laboratories, plague doctors bent over bubbling flasks, their beaked masks swapped for leather aprons as they pursued the ultimate prize, the philosopher's stone. Alchemy wasn't just a side hobby for many of these physicians. It was the cutting-edge science of their era, a tantalizing blend of chemistry, mysticism, and sheer desperation. When the plague ravaged Europe, these men, already steeped in the language of transmutation, saw an opportunity to turn base metals into medical miracles. The result, a dangerous dance with toxins that often killed faster than the disease itself. Take mercury, the alchemist's favorite paradox, known as quicksilver. This shimmering liquid metal was believed to hold the secret to purification. Plague doctors would distill it into elixirs or rub it directly onto buboes, convinced its otherworldly properties could drive out corruption. What they didn't realize was that mercury attacks the nervous system, causing tremors, madness, and excruciating kidney failure. Venetian archives describe patients who survived the plague only to succumb to seizures, their bodies racked by the very cure meant to save them. Yet the doctors persisted, their logic twisted by alchemical dogma. If mercury could transform dull ore into gold, surely it could transform sickness into health. Arsenic, too, found its way into their potions, a poison repurposed as salvation. Alchemists revered its ability to preserve corpses, mistaking this grotesque property for healing potential. Some plague doctors prescribed arsenic-laced sun tablets, small discs stamped with astrological symbols and dissolved in wine. The rationale: since arsenic mimicked fever symptoms, flushed skin, rapid pulse, it must be drawing out the disease. In reality, these treatments accelerated dehydration, pushing weakened patients over the edge. A haunting account from Prague describes a wealthy merchant who paid 3 sacks of silver for a week's supply, only to vomit blood until his throat corroded. Why cling to such deadly methods? The answer lies in the alchemist's worldview, where every substance held hidden virtues waiting to be unlocked. To these practitioners, mercury and arsenic weren't just elements, they were cosmic keys capable of balancing the body's metallic humors. When a patient improved, even briefly, it was proof the treatment worked. When they died, the dose was deemed insufficient, not the theory flawed. This circular reasoning created a feedback loop of escalating toxicity, with each failure justifying more extreme measures. The tragic brilliance of their approach becomes clear when contrasted with modern medicine. Today, we know small doses of arsenic actually do treat certain blood disorders, and mercury compounds were used in early syphilis medications. The plague doctors stumbled toward these truths centuries early, but without the tools to separate poison from remedy. Their experiments, for all their lethality, represented something profound: the human refusal to accept helplessness. Even as they poisoned their patients, they were laying groundwork for future toxicology, proving that sometimes the path to discovery is paved with deadly mistakes. Perhaps the most poignant legacy of this alchemical pursuit is how it mirrors our own medical gambles. From chemotherapy to radiation, many modern treatments walk the same razor's edge between toxicity and cure. The plague doctors, in their groping toward solutions, remind us that scientific progress is rarely clean or kind. Their beakers of quicksilver and vials of arsenic weren't just medieval curiosities. They were the first shaky steps down a road we're still traveling, where the line between poison and medicine remains as thin as a scalpel's edge. The beaked masks and waxed robes of plague doctors might seem like relics of superstition, but look closer, you'll find the DNA of modern epidemiology woven into their desperate practices. While their understanding of disease was steeped in miasma theory and alchemy, their instinct to separate the sick from the healthy, to cover their skin, and to document outbreaks laid foundations we still rely on today. Consider the parallels. Their quarantine protocols, crude as they were, mirror our own isolation strategies during recent pandemics. The Venetian lazarettos, floating isolation hospitals, weren't just medieval holding pens. They were early attempts at breaking chains of transmission, a principle now central to public health. One of their most prescient innovations was record-keeping. Plague doctors meticulously tracked deaths, noting patterns in neighborhoods and families. In Marseille, a physician named Jacques documented how the disease spread faster along trade routes, hinting at the concept of vectors centuries before germ theory. Their handwritten ledgers, filled with dates and symptoms, became the first rudimentary disease maps, precursors to the data dashboards we scrutinize during modern outbreaks. Even their failures taught vital lessons. When bloodletting accelerated deaths, it challenged Galenic dogma, nudging medicine toward evidence-based practice. Their tragic experiments with mercury and arsenic, though deadly, inadvertently advanced toxicology by revealing the fine line between poison and remedy. Yet their legacy isn't just about what they got right, it's about resilience in the face of the unknown. When COVID-19 emerged, healthcare workers donned PPE strikingly similar in principle to those waxed robes, battling an invisible enemy just as the plague doctors once did. The psychological toll, too, echoes across centuries. Like their medieval counterparts, modern nurses and doctors faced isolation, stigma, and the unbearable weight of triage choices. The difference: today's tools are grounded in science, not superstition. Those haunting beaks have been replaced by N95 respirators, their herb pouches swapped for antiviral filters, proof of how far we've come. But perhaps the most enduring lesson lies in their humanity. For all their misguided methods, plague doctors walked into the epicenter of suffering when others fled. Their courage, flawed, desperate, but unwavering, set a precedent for medical duty that still defines the profession. When we study their triumphs and catastrophes, we're not just examining history, we're holding up a mirror to our own struggles with uncertainty. Their story reminds us that progress isn't linear, it's a messy, often painful climb from darkness toward light. And in that climb, even the most maligned figures can become unexpected guides. Long after the last plague doctor hung up their waxed robes, their ghost lingered in the collective imagination, no longer just a healer, but something far more unsettling. Across Europe, whispers spread of masked figures spotted near graveyards at dusk, their beaks twitching as if sniffing out the next outbreak. In rural villages, mothers warned children that the plague doctor's shadow could curse a household, while in bustling cities, rumors swirled of secret societies preserving their knowledge for apocalyptic futures. The line between history and myth blurred until the physician became a prophet, the costume a conduit for humanity's deepest terrors. Some legends took root in chilling real events. In Prague, a traveling doctor named Gregorius was said to have predicted deaths with uncanny accuracy until townsfolk discovered his ledger, pre-filled with names before he ever met his patients. Was he a fraud, or had he truly bargained with darker forces? Similar tales emerged from Edinburgh, where a plague doctor's abandoned journal allegedly contained sketches of victims' days before they fell ill. These stories fed the belief that the masked figures weren't just fighting the plague, they were its heralds, their very presence an omen of impending doom. The supernatural associations weren't entirely unfounded. Many plague doctors dabbled in practices that straddled medicine and magic. Some prescribed amulets inscribed with astrological sigils, while others buried corpses face down with garlic in their mouths to trap the pestilence. When these rituals coincided with a lull in deaths, it was easy to credit the doctor's arcane knowledge rather than the epidemic's natural ebb. Even their herbal beak stuffings took on mystical significance. Folklorists in Transylvania recorded tales of masks that drank the sickness from the air, their herbs turning black as they absorbed corruption. But why does this mythic version persist when we know the scientific reality? The answer lies in how humans process trauma. Faced with random, mass suffering, we invent narratives where someone or something holds the reins. If the plague doctor could control death, even as its agent, then catastrophe wasn't senseless. It had rules, however cruel. This psychological need birthed figures like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, often depicted in plague doctor attire, a stranger who cleansed a town of its children, mirroring the epidemic's indiscriminate toll. Modern pop culture keeps reshaping this legacy. From horror games where plague doctors are necromancers to fantasy novels casting them as time-traveling pandemic wardens, the figure's adaptability proves its power. Perhaps because in an age of vaccines and microscopes, we still crave symbols for the existential threats we can't fully control. The plague doctor's myth endures not despite their historical irrelevance, but because of it. They remind us that when faced with the abyss, humanity will always conjure stories to fill the void between knowledge and fear. During the chaotic early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, an eerie silhouette began appearing in unexpected places: protest marches, social media memes, even high-fashion editorials. The plague doctor's beaked mask, a relic from humanity's darkest medical history, had somehow become a viral symbol for our modern crisis. In Italy, demonstrators against lockdowns donned the iconic headpiece as a grim joke about government overreach, while online, the image morphed into dark humor, when your Zoom meeting could have been an email captioned over a masked figure holding a parchment. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was a collective reckoning with how little had changed. What makes this resurgence so startling is how effortlessly the 400-year-old design mapped onto contemporary fears. Like their medieval counterparts, today's healthcare workers draped themselves in layers of protective gear, their faces obscured behind masks and face shields, uncanny echoes of those waxed robes and glass-eyed beaks. The parallels ran deeper than aesthetics. Just as plague doctors were both revered and shunned, modern nurses faced applause from balconies one day and eviction threats the next, their scrubs suddenly seen as contamination risks. The mask became more than a medical tool. It was a Rorschach test for societal anxieties, revealing whether we saw caregivers as heroes or hazards. Even the science behind these distant pandemics converged in unexpected ways. Medieval doctors stuffed their beaks with herbs to ward off miasma, while 2020 saw debates over whether N95 filters or cloth face coverings better stopped viral particles. Both eras grappled with the same core question: how to breathe safely in poisoned air. The difference, of course, is that today we understand aerosols instead of evil spirits, but the instinct to armor ourselves against invisible threats remains unchanged. Perhaps the most poignant resurrection occurred in art and protest. Street murals from Berlin to Los Angeles reimagined the plague doctor holding a vaccine syringe or wearing a Black Lives Matter armband, transforming the figure from omen to ally. Memes recast the beak as a commentary on social distancing, medieval version of staying 6 feet apart. This cultural repurposing speaks to humanity's knack for coping through reinvention. When reality feels apocalyptic, sometimes the only way forward is to dress up the nightmare in familiar costumes, making the unimaginable feel like just another chapter in our long dance with disease. Yet beneath the dark humor lies a sobering truth. The plague doctor's endurance as a symbol reminds us that pandemics aren't anomalies, they're recurring patterns in human history. Every generation believes its crisis is unprecedented, only to discover the same fears, the same stigmatization of healers, the same desperate scramble for remedies playing out again. That beaked mask persists because it's more than a relic. It's a mirror reflecting our perpetual vulnerability and our stubborn refusal to surrender to it. When we laugh at memes of plague doctors holding hand sanitizer, we're not just mocking the past, we're asserting that if humanity survived those dark ages, we can weather this too. The costume endures not as a warning, but as a strangely comforting reminder. We've been here before, and we're still standing. The weight of those beaked masks wasn't just physical. It pressed down on the conscience of every plague doctor forced to play God in the face of overwhelming death. Picture a crowded pest house in 17th century London, straw pallets overflowing with the sick, their cries merging into a single chorus of agony. With only one doctor for every 100 patients, impossible choices had to be made in seconds. Do you treat the child burning with fever, or the breadwinner whose survival might save an entire family from starvation? Should precious vinegar-soaked bandages go to the merchant who can pay or the beggar closest to death? These weren't theoretical debates, they were split-second decisions etched in guilt and grief, their consequences measured in funerals. Historical accounts reveal haunting parallels to modern triage nightmares. A physician's journal from Marseille describes marking patients' foreheads with charcoal circles for those who might survive, crosses for the doomed left to perish without care. In Vienna, doctors prioritized the young over the elderly, a brutal calculus borrowed from battlefield medicine. What's chilling is how these protocols resurfaced during COVID-19, when overwhelmed hospitals faced ventilator shortages and ICU bed rationing. The same ethical dilemmas that tormented medieval healers distributing limited resources, balancing individual worth against community survival, still haunt our triage protocols today. The tools have changed, but the heart-wrenching choices remain eerily familiar. Yet the plague doctor's struggles went beyond mere triage. Their very presence posed ethical quandaries. Many were paid per patient, incentivizing them to take on more cases than they could properly treat. In Turin, records show practitioners signing contracts that paid extra for high-risk visits, essentially profiting from desperation. Others faced coercion, convicted criminals given the choice between serving as plague doctors or execution. Imagine the moral corrosion of someone forced into medicine under threat of death, their hands trembling as they applied leeches to dying strangers. The system blurred lines between healer and opportunist, Leaving Chinese letter to wonder how many acted from compassion versus survival instinct. The most profound ethical shadow, however, fell on those who abandoned their posts. While some doctors stayed until they collapsed from exhaustion, others fled like the infamous Dr. Ria of Padua, who disguised himself as a monk to escape a quarantined city. Contemporary chroniclers condemned these deserters, but modern eyes might recognize the breaking point of human endurance. When a physician in Avignon wrote of washing his hands until they bled, then drinking himself into oblivion to mute the screams in his memory, was that cowardice or the inevitable toll of bearing witness to relentless suffering? What history teaches us isn't judgment but perspective. These dilemmas weren't failures of character, they were failures of systems unprepared for catastrophe. The plague doctor's agonizing choices reveal how easily ethical frameworks crumble under pandemic pressures, forcing individuals to make compromises that would be unthinkable in peacetime. Their legacy challenges us to ask, how do we prepare not just our hospitals, but our moral infrastructures for the next inevitable crisis? Because the true test of humanity isn't whether we avoid impossible choices, but how we reckon with them afterward, and what we do to ensure fewer faces hidden behind masks, medieval or modern, must make them again. Beneath the waxed robes and beaked masks, plague doctors carried another tool, one far more revealing than their lancets or leeches. Hidden in satchels stained with vinegar and herbs, their personal journals captured the unvarnished truth of the Black Death, not as history remembers it, but as they lived it. These fragile pages, some still bearing smudges of sweat or tears, offer something rare in medieval medicine, a heartbeat. Take the diary of Dr. Heinrich von Staden, who practiced in Nuremberg during the outbreak of 1348. Between notes on buboes and burial counts, he scribbled a single line that shatters the myth of clinical detachment. Today I held a girl no older than my daughter as the light left her eyes. God forgive me for counting her among the numbers. What emerges from these journals is a portrait of men torn between duty and despair. Venetian physician Giovanni della Torre's ledger begins with precise case notes, fever durations, lymph node sizes, but descends into frantic sketches of winged demons by week 3. Another from Lyon records a haunting ritual. Each night, the doctor would wash his gloves in rosewater, not for purification, but to remember the scent of life. These weren't just medical logs, they were lifelines, a place to voice horrors that couldn't be spoken aloud in a world where showing weakness might get you branded a heretic or coward. The most revealing entries expose the loneliness of their vocation. A Parisian journal describes how townspeople would cross themselves when a plague doctor passed, as if he were death's herald. Another recounts being served food on a long pole to avoid touch, the bread sometimes sprinkled with salt, not for flavor, but because folk believed it warded off corruption. Yet amid this isolation, glimmers of dark humor surface. One Scottish doctor doodled caricatures of patients demanding unicorn horn remedies, captioning them, "Fool's gold for foolish hopes." Perhaps the most poignant discovery is how these writings evolved as the plague progressed. Early pages brim with Gaelic theories and elaborate treatments, but later entries grow sparse, sometimes just lists of names with a cross beside each. The shift speaks volumes. When entire families perished overnight, meticulous science gave way to bare survival. A Hamburg physician's final entry, "No more ink, no more hope," was written in what forensic analysis suggests was his own blood. These journals do more than document symptoms. They humanize figures we've mythologized as either monsters or saints. Between the lines of fading ink, we find men who cracked jokes to stay sane, who prayed over strangers when priests refused to come, who sometimes stole sips of wine from the dying just to numb the horror. Their words remind us that the greatest cost of the plague wasn't measured in body counts, but in the silent shattering of those who stood at the bedside, counting. The shadow of the plague doctor stretches far beyond the pages of history. It lingers in the dim corners of modern folklore, where whispers tell of ghostly figures in beaked masks still patrolling the backstreets of Venice or Prague. These urban legends didn't spring from nowhere. They're woven from the same threads of fear and mystery that once made entire towns shudder at the sight of those waxed robes. Take the recurring tale of the wandering physician, said to haunt the catacombs beneath Paris, his hollow eyes gleaming behind cracked glass lenses as he counts invisible victims. Or the chilling accounts from Edinburgh's underground vaults, where tourists swear they've heard the rhythmic tap of a wooden cane echoing through empty tunnels long after closing time. What fuels these stories isn't just the eerie costume, it's the unresolved trauma lingering in cities that lost half their populations to the plague. In places like Vienna or Marseille, where mass graves still lie beneath shopping districts, the collective memory of loss transforms history into haunting. Locals might joke about the doctor of Peston Street who appears during foggy nights, but beneath the humor lies a darker truth. These legends are how we process the unimaginable. When a disease erases entire families, leaving no one to mourn them, the mind conjures ghosts to fill the silence. The plague doctor, already a spectral figure in life, becomes the perfect vessel for those unspoken griefs. Then there are the so-called cursed artifacts, beaked masks discovered in attic trunks or antique shops, said to bring sickness to anyone who wears them. A notable example surfaced in 2012 when a Berlin collector claimed his replica plague Dr. Mask coincided with a mysterious fever. Medical tests revealed nothing, yet the story spread like wildfire online, morphing into a modern campfire tale. It's no coincidence that these legends often involve touch or contamination. They're echoes of the very fears that once made townspeople flinch from a doctor's gloved hand. The most fascinating twist, some legends flip the script entirely. In certain Italian villages, the plague doctor isn't a harbinger of doom but a protective spirit. Farmers once hung wooden beak masks in barns to ward off livestock diseases, a folkloric nod to the physicians who tried and failed to shield their ancestors. This duality captures the essence of why these stories endure. The plague doctor lives in our imagination as both monster and guardian, a reminder that even in our darkest hours, someone stood between us and the abyss. Perhaps the deepest truth lies in what these legends reveal about our relationship with history. The plague doctors who walk through urban myths aren't real historical figures anymore. They're mirrors reflecting our own anxieties about pandemics, isolation, and invisible threats. When a TikTok video of a costumed ghost in a Venetian alley goes viral, it's not just about scares, it's about connecting across centuries to a time when the world felt just as fragile as it does today. The beaked mask endures because it's more than a relic. It's a symbol we keep reinventing, dressing our deepest fears in feathers and wax so we can face them on our own terms. The plague doctor's beaked mask, once a terrifying symbol of pestilence, now struts down fashion runways and steampunk conventions, its silhouette reimagined in polished brass and embroidered velvet. This bizarre transformation, from medical horror to haute couture, reveals something startling about how we process history's darkest chapters. In the hands of modern subcultures, the mask has shed its grim associations, becoming a blank canvas for rebellion and reinvention. A goth designer might pair it with lace and leather, turning the emblem of death into a statement about beauty in decay, while a steampunk enthusiast crafts a gleaming copper version, celebrating its retro-futuristic aesthetic. But beneath the creativity lies a deeper question. Why do we feel compelled to resurrect and romanticize such a charged relic? Part of the answer lies in the mask's inherent theatricality. With its exaggerated curves and mysterious hollow eyes, the design is irresistibly bold, perfect for subcultures that thrive on visual drama. Yet there's also a defiant irony at play. By wearing the plague doctor's mask as fashion, these communities reclaim a symbol of fear, stripping it of its original power. It's a way of laughing in the face of mortality, much like medieval carnival goers who wore exaggerated versions during festivals to mock death itself. The difference: today's wearers aren't just mocking death, they're transforming it into an accessory, a way to signal individuality in a world still grappling with pandemics and existential threats. This cultural repurposing isn't without controversy. Some historians argue it trivializes the suffering of millions, turning a tool of desperation into a costume party prop. Others see it as a natural evolution, proof that even the most traumatic symbols can be redeemed through creativity. The mask's journey mirrors how pirates' Jolly Roger flags became children's toys, or how Viking helmets never actually horned morphed into sports mascots. Time softens edges, allowing us to engage with the past on new terms. What's most fascinating is how the mask's meaning shifts depending on who wears it. In a Tokyo street fashion scene, it might symbolize avant-garde artistry, while at a Renaissance fair, it becomes a quirky historical nod. For some, it's a political statement, a critique of modern healthcare failures, or a protest against surveillance. The mask's mutability proves its staying power. It's no longer just a medical artifact, but a mirror reflecting whatever fears or fantasies we project onto it. Perhaps this is why the design endures. Whether dangling from a steampunk's belt or glaring from a goth's ensemble, the plague doctor's mask remains a conversation starter, a bridge between past horrors and present playfulness. It reminds us that history isn't static. It's clay in our hands, waiting to be reshaped into something that speaks to who we are now. And in an age where pandemics still haunt us, there's something cathartic about turning their most iconic symbol into something we control, even if just for the sake of fashion. There's something uniquely unsettling about the way a plague doctor's mask stares back at you from the pages of a horror novel or the flickering screen of a video game. Those hollow glass eyes and that elongated beak, frozen in silent judgment. This figure, born from the desperation of medieval medicine, has slithered its way into our darkest stories, becoming shorthand for existential terror. Think of the infamous plague doctor from Darkest Dungeon, his whispers promising both cure and corruption, or the spectral physicians haunting the alleys of Bloodborne, where their surgical tools drip with more than just blood. Why does this particular silhouette cut so deep into our collective nightmares? The answer lies in its perfect storm of symbolism, the cold rationality of science twisted into something grotesque, the thin line between healer and harvester of souls, and the visceral fear of contagion made flesh. Horror thrives on contradictions, and the plague doctor is walking paradox. Here was a figure meant to save lives, yet draped in the aesthetic of death itself, a reminder that even those sworn to protect us can become agents of suffering. Gothic literature latched onto this duality early. In Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death, the titular villain isn't a traditional monster but a spectral figure clad in blood-stained robes, his face hidden behind a mask eerily reminiscent of a plague doctor's. Poe understood the power of this imagery. It's not just the threat of disease, but the betrayal of trust. When the healer's tools become instruments of torment, it undermines our deepest instincts about safety. Modern horror games amplify this by making plague doctors active predators. In Assassin's Creed, they're alchemists dabbling in human experiments. In The Sinking City, they're cultists using their medical knowledge to prolong agony. The message is clear: knowledge without ethics is a weapon, but the terror goes deeper than just betrayal. The plague doctor's costume is a masterclass in Uncanny Valley. That beak, which once held herbs to ward off miasma, now reads as something barely human, a face stretched into unnatural proportions, more avian than mortal. Horror designers exploit this relentlessly. Look at Scorn's biomechanical nightmares or Resident Evil's virus-mutated surgeons. All owe a debt to the plague doctor's distorted silhouette. Our brains recoil at things that almost resemble us but aren't quite right, and that beak sits squarely in the discomfort zone. Even the sound design plays into it: the rasp of leather gloves, the rhythmic tap of a cane on cobblestones, the muffled breathing behind the mask. These aren't just aesthetic choices, they're psychological triggers, tapping into primal fears of contamination and the unseen. What's most fascinating, though, is how the plague doctor's horror appeal evolves with our own anxieties. During the AIDS crisis, the figure resurfaced in art as a metaphor for societal abandonment. In pandemic-era indie games like Plague Inc., they're recast as bureaucratic enforcers, their masks now gas filters as they drag the infected to quarantine zones. Each generation reinvents the symbol to reflect its unique fears, but the core remains. The plague doctor is the embodiment of our oldest, most visceral dread: the fear that when catastrophe strikes, even those meant to protect us might become part of the terror. And perhaps that's why this medieval relic still haunts our screens and pages. In a world where viruses cross oceans in hours and trust in institutions wavers, the plague doctor isn't just a monster from history. He's a mirror reflecting back our own vulnerability and the chilling truth that sometimes the things we design to save us can become the very shapes of our nightmares. Hidden among the plague doctor's arsenal of lancets and leeches were remedies so fantastical they bordered on alchemy treatments that sound more like ingredients from a witch's brew than medical science. Take the infamous unicorn horn powder, a substance so coveted that kings would pay fortunes for a single dose. What patients didn't know: they were ingesting ground narwhal tusks, harvested from Arctic whales and sold with elaborate myths about their divine origins. Medieval texts claimed this powder could neutralize poison, purify blood, and even repel the plague itself. The reality was far grimmer. desperate families would dissolve it in wine, watching for miraculous recoveries that never came, unaware they were swallowing little more than calcium and keratin. Then there were the gemstone cures, where crushed emeralds, rubies, and sapphires were mixed into syrups or worn as amulets. Physicians swore these minerals emitted celestial vibrations capable of realigning the body's humors. A recipe from a 14th century Florentine manuscript instructs healers to combine powdered jade with rosewater, promising it would draw the pestilence from the lungs like a magnet. The tragic irony, some of these stones, like malachite, contained toxic copper compounds that slowly poisoned patients, turning their skin green as the very illness they sought to cure. Perhaps the most shocking lost remedy was the oil of swallows, a concoction made by distilling the birds alive in sealed jars. Apothecaries believed the swallow's ability to migrate symbolized purity, trapping their essence in a viscous liquid that smelled of burnt feathers. Applied to buboes or drunk in vinegar, it was thought to grant the patient the bird's resilience. What makes these remedies more than just historical curiosities is the logic behind them. Each reflected the medieval worldview, a universe where every substance, no matter how grotesque, held hidden correspondences. If a gem sparkled like the heavens, surely it could heal. If a unicorn horn came from a mythical beast, its power must be boundless. Yet some cures vanished not because they failed, but because they worked too well, just not in the ways intended. Take the vinegar of the four thieves, a blend of garlic, wormwood, and herbs steeped in stolen grave goods. Legend claimed a band of grave robbers drank it to avoid infection while looting the dead. Modern tests show the formula had real antiseptic properties, likely from the garlic's allicin. Similarly, the much-mocked plague water, a distillation of rosemary and sage, may have eased nausea, if not the plague itself. These remedies weren't abandoned for being useless, but because they belonged to an oral tradition erased by the rise of institutional medicine. The darkest chapter, though, involves remedies deliberately stricken from records. In 17th century Prague, a physician named Ign as Semmelweis discovered that mercury-laced sun tablets were killing more patients than the plague. When he tried to expose the practice, his notes were burned by colleagues protecting their lucrative trade. Other treatments, like lead-based salves or arsenic inhalants, were quietly dropped as their horrors became undeniable, not through scientific progress, but through whispered warnings and buried bodies. What these lost remedies reveal isn't just medieval ignorance, but the painful birth pangs of modern medicine. For every absurdity like powdered mummy or toad venom, there was a glimmer of intuition, like the doctors who prescribed moldy bread for infections centuries before penicillin. The plague doctor's pharmacopoeia was a mirror of their era, brutal, beautiful, and utterly convinced that somewhere in the chaos of trial and error lay the key to salvation. Their failures paved the way for our successes, their desperation a reminder that even the strangest cures were born from the same impulse that drives medicine today, the refusal to let death have the final word. When the Black Death swept through Europe, it didn't just ravage bodies, it shattered spiritual certainty. In an age where illness was often interpreted as God's wrath, the plague doctor's arrival stirred a dangerous cocktail of fear and fanaticism. Some towns welcomed these masked figures as earthly angels, believing their strange costumes held divine power to ward off punishment. Records from Avignon describe crowds kneeling as doctors passed, kissing the hems of their waxed robes like relics. Others saw something far more sinister: the devil's own physicians, their beaked masks resembling the grotesque faces of medieval depictions of demons. This duality tore communities apart, turning public health measures into spiritual battlegrounds. The religious panic manifested in chilling ways. In Strasbourg, a plague doctor was burned at the stake after a delirious patient claimed his mask whispered blasphemies. German woodcuts from the era show doctors with halos one moment, then consorting with skeletons the next. Even their medical tools became symbols of heresy. The lancet accused of drawing unholy humors, the leeches branded as familiars sent by Satan. This wasn't just superstition, it was the terror of a society grappling with existential questions. If God was punishing sinners, why did the devout perish while scoundrels survived? The plague doctor, moving freely among the dying, became a convenient scapegoat for this unbearable theological contradiction. Some physicians leaned into their spiritual role with disturbing fervor. A Franciscan monk-turned plague doctor in Milan would anoint patients with holy oil before bloodletting, declaring the procedures penance for pestilence. Others distributed parchment amulets inscribed with psalms, charging exorbitant fees for what amounted to medieval indulgences. The line between medicine and ministry blurred completely in places like Montpellier, where plague doctors led funeral processions in their masks, chanting Latin dirges over mass graves. For desperate communities, these rituals offered something science couldn't: a framework to comprehend the incomprehensible. Yet the darkest twist came when religious hysteria corrupted public health. In Valencia, a doctor advocating quarantine was denounced for defying God's will. His lazaretto burned by mobs convinced isolation interfered with divine judgment. Nuremberg's council records tell of physicians being barred from churches, their very presence considered sacrilege. This backlash had deadly consequences. Historians estimate towns that rejected plague doctors on religious grounds suffered 20% higher mortality rates. The tragedy wasn't just the lives lost, but the realization dawning too late. In demonizing those trying to help, communities had unwittingly become accomplices to their own destruction. What lingers isn't just the historical irony, but the uncomfortable parallels to modern crises. When fear grips societies, the impulse to spiritualize suffering resurfaces, whether through blaming marginalized groups or framing disasters as cosmic tests. The plague doctor's ordeal reveals a timeless truth. In the shadow of catastrophe, humanity will always wrestle with the divine, seeking meaning where none may exist. Their masks, intended as medical tools, became Rorschach blots for medieval Europe's collective terror, and a warning about what happens when science collides with the fire of fanaticism. The plague doctor's haunting silhouette has slithered into the halls of modern medicine, its beaked mask staring out from university crests and public health campaigns with eerie persistence. At the University of Pavia's medical school in Italy, a stylized plague doctor adorns the official seal, framed by laurels, a tribute to those who battled the Black Death. Meanwhile, in the Czech Republic, the National Museum of Medicine displays a replica costume as a solemn reminder of medicine's turbulent past. This duality, celebrated emblem and cautionary tale, reveals how deeply we still wrestle with the contradictions of progress. Is this figure a badge of honor for those who face pandemics, or a grim monument to the limits of human understanding? What's fascinating is how selectively we've reshaped the symbol. The International Red Cross's pandemic response teams occasionally use the image in training materials, emphasizing the plague doctor's role as an early public health pioneer. Yet they carefully avoid the more sinister associations, focusing instead on themes of sacrifice and containment. Contrast this with the World Health Organization's subtle distancing from the imagery. Their archives show internal debates from the 2010 H1N1 outbreak about whether invoking the plague doctor would inspire or terrify. The split reflects a deeper tension. Do we memorialize the courage of those who fought blindly, or the hubris of methods that often did more harm than good? This selective memory plays out in medical education too. Some European anatomy textbooks feature historical sidebars praising plague doctors for their meticulous record-keeping, while others highlight their reliance on mercury and bloodletting as warnings against pseudoscience. The symbol becomes a Rorschach test for how we view medical history. Is it a triumphant march toward enlightenment, or a series of stumbles in the dark? Even the tools have been reinterpreted. That infamous beaked mask now appears in some infection control courses as a primitive precursor to modern respirators. Its herb pouch reframed as an early attempt at filtration rather than superstition. Perhaps the most poignant adoption comes from unlikely places. During the 2020 COVID surge, nurses in Barcelona painted plague doctor murals outside their hospitals, not as homage to medieval methods, but as a rallying cry against abandonment. They were alone then, we're alone now. Read one caption beneath the iconic mask, transforming the symbol into a protest against systemic failures that stretch across centuries. Similarly, mental health advocates have reclaimed the image to discuss caregiver trauma, drawing parallels between the isolation of plague doctors and today's burned-out medical staff. The mask's persistence in medical symbolism forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Progress isn't linear. We honor the plague doctor not because they had answers, but because they kept asking questions in the face of unimaginable horror. Their legacy isn't in the cures they failed to find, but in the precedent they set that even when knowledge falters, the duty to stand between humanity and the abyss remains. When that silhouette appears on a university shield or a memorial plaque, it whispers a challenge to every new generation of healers. Remember how much we once didn't know and how much we still have left to learn. That hollow-eyed beak and blank stare do more than unsettle us. They tap into primal corners of the human psyche that even modern psychologists struggle to fully unravel. The plague doctor's mask isn't just creepy. It's a masterclass in triggering what researchers call the uncanny valley effect. This phenomenon explains why we recoil from things that appear almost human, but not quite like lifelike robots or wax figures with slightly off proportions. The mask's elongated beak and round glass eyes create a grotesque distortion of facial features, landing squarely in that psychological danger zone where our brains scream wrongness before we can even articulate why. Studies using fMRI scans show that viewing such images lights up the amygdala, the brain's fear center, with activity comparable to seeing a coiled snake or a loaded gun. But there's another layer at work here, the concept of ambiguous threat. Unlike clearly dangerous symbols like skulls or fangs, the plague doctor's mask occupies a liminal space between healer and harbinger. Psychologists at the University of London found that test subjects shown images of the mask reported significantly higher anxiety levels than those shown traditional, scary imagery like ghosts or monsters. The reason our brains struggle to categorize it is this a protector or predator? That unresolved tension creates a unique kind of dread, one that lingers far longer than straightforward fright. It's the same mechanism that makes clowns or dolls with frozen smiles so unsettling. Their outward harmlessness clashes with an underlying sense of menace. The mask also exploits what's known as contamination anxiety, a deep-rooted fear ingrained by centuries of evolutionary survival instincts. The beak's association with disease triggers what psychologists term the behavioral immune system, an unconscious aversion to anything linked with pathogens. In experiments where participants handled replica plague doctor masks, even those who knew the objects were sterile showed increased hand-washing behaviors afterward. This reaction mirrors medieval villagers who recoiled from actual plague doctors, instinctively associating their costumes with invisible death. modern public health campaigns inadvertently tap into the same psychology when they use the silhouette in pandemic warnings, proof that certain symbols retain their emotional power across centuries. Perhaps most fascinating is how the mask's psychological impact shifts across cultures. Research comparing European and Asian responses reveals stark differences, where Western subjects predominantly associate it with historical trauma. Many East Asian participants link it to contemporary biohazard imagery due to its visual similarity to modern PP. This cultural lens effect demonstrates how symbols accumulate meaning like geological strata, each generation adding new fears to old foundations. The mask becomes a psychological Rorschach test. What you see in its blank gaze says as much about your collective memory as it does about universal fear responses. What makes this symbol endure isn't just its ability to frighten, but its capacity to evolve. From triggering medieval peasants' miasma phobias to activating modern germophobia, the plague doctor's mask demonstrates how deeply visual cues shape our survival instincts. Neuroscience now confirms what the past 6 centuries intuited. Some fears don't need to be learned. They're etched into our neural pathways, waiting for the right combination of curves and shadows to awaken them. And that may be the most unsettling truth of all. The mask frightens us not because it's alien, but because it reminds us how thin the veil really is between rationality and primal terror. When the last plague wards emptied and the death carts ceased their grim rounds, Europe's plague doctors found themselves stranded between two worlds no longer needed as healers, yet too tainted by death to rejoin ordinary society. Some simply vanished, their final fates as obscure as the identities hidden beneath those waxed robes. Municipal records from Lyon show a handful were paid a final pittance and sent away with warnings never to return, their service rewarded with exile. Others met darker ends. A physician in Frankfurt was found floating in the Main River, his beaked mask stuffed with the unpaid invoices of grieving families. The very costume that once commanded fear now marked them as pariahs, walking reminders of a nightmare everyone longed to forget. A few attempted reinvention with varying success. In Venice, former plague Dr. Marco della Torre repurposed his knowledge of herbs into a perfumery business, though locals claimed his shops always smelled faintly of vinegar and decay. Paris saw one ex-physician become a celebrated anatomist, his familiarity with corpses lending gruesome credibility to public dissections. But for most, the transition proved impossible. The psychological toll surfaced in odd ways. One man in Prague took to wearing his mask indoors, insisting the scent of lavender still clung to its folds years after the plague's end. Another, documented in Nuremberg's asylum ledgers, compulsively washed his hands until they bled, convinced invisible miasma lingered beneath his nails. History's recollection of these figures twisted with time. By the 18th century, plague doctors had been recast as carnival curiosities, their likenesses appearing in satirical prints mocking medieval ignorance. Romantic poets later romanticized them as tragic, solitary figures, a far cry from the often pragmatic, sometimes ruthless practitioners they truly were. The most enduring distortion came from 19th-century physicians, who selectively celebrated plague doctors as early public health pioneers while omitting their reliance on mercury and bloodletting. This sanitized version allowed modern medicine to claim a heroic lineage, glossing over the centuries of trial and lethal error that preceded genuine understanding. Yet fragments of truth persist in unexpected places. A church ledger in Provence records an anonymous donation from a doctor of the pestilence to fund orphans of the plague, a rare glimpse of compassion amid the horror. In a Vienna museum, a child's sketch from 1621 shows a masked figure handing out apples rather than lancets, suggesting some communities remembered kindness alongside fear. These scattered traces complicate the caricature, reminding us that behind every beak was a human being who'd witnessed things no one should. The plague doctor's ultimate legacy may lie not in how they were remembered, but in what their disappearance revealed. When the last of them hung up their robes, it marked more than the end of an era. It signaled humanity's uneasy pivot from mysticism to empiricism, from battling unseen wrath to scrutinizing tangible causes. Their vanishing act was, in its way, the first step toward modern medicine. Yet 6 centuries later, when new pandemics grip the world, we still reach for their imagery, proof that some shadows never fully fade, no matter how brightly science shines. The plague doctor's silhouette lingers in our collective memory, not just as a relic of medieval medicine, but as a mirror reflecting humanity's eternal dance with crisis. That haunting beak and those hollow glass eyes capture something timeless: the tension between knowledge and fear, between the impulse to heal and the terror of the uncontrollable. Centuries may separate us from the Black Death, but the echoes of that era resonate unmistakably in modern hospitals and research labs. When COVID-19 sent nurses scrambling for PPE, when conspiracy theories swirled like miasma, when communities oscillated between gratitude and suspicion toward healthcare workers, we were reliving the same primal script, only with microscopes and vaccines replacing herb-stuffed masks. What makes their legacy so enduring isn't just the macabre costume or the misguided remedies, it's the raw humanity beneath the waxed robes. These weren't mythical figures, but ordinary men thrust into extraordinary horror, armed with little more than desperation and the flawed science of their time. Their failures, the mercury poisoning, the futile bloodletting, reveal how easily good intentions can falter without evidence. Yet their perseverance, documented in those fragile, wine-stained journals, speaks to a courage that transcends centuries. They remind us that progress isn't born from perfection, but from the messy, often heartbreaking work of facing the unknown head-on. The deeper lesson lies in how we choose to remember them. For all their errors, plague doctors were among the first to systematize quarantine, to document symptoms, to stand firm when others fled. Their story warns against the twin traps of hero worship and hindsight bias. We can honor their sacrifice while acknowledging the harm of their methods. Today, as we debate pandemic policies and vaccine hesitancy, their history whispers a cautionary tale. Fear distorts, but so does arrogance. The physicians who clung to Gaelic dogma despite mounting evidence mirror our own modern reluctance to pivot when new data emerges. Perhaps the most poignant parallel is the stigma they carried, the way their very uniforms marked them as both saviors and pariahs. That duality lives on in the exhausted faces of today's healthcare workers, celebrated with balcony applause one day, then shunned on public transport the next. The plague doctor's mask, once a barrier against disease, became a symbol of isolation. Our N95 respirators and face shields now carry the same unintended weight. The costumes change, but the human drama beneath them remains startlingly familiar. As we close this chapter, their story challenges us to ask, what masks will future generations study in museums, marveling at our blend of ingenuity and ignorance? The plague doctor's greatest gift isn't in the answers they left, but in the questions they force us to confront about resilience, ethics, and the price of progress. Their shadows stretch long because they're not just figures of the past, they're reflections of who we are when catastrophe strikes, and who we might yet become. If this journey through medicine's darkest corridors left you fascinated, let's keep exploring history's untold stories together. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. What other enigmatic figures or forgotten crises should we uncover next? And if you want to delve deeper into the intersections of science and society, don't forget to subscribe. The past is never truly dead. It's just waiting for us